Also would like to give thanks to some folks that helped pull this off. The IT department for Swain County, the Canary Coalition, and we've talked to you to be sure to look on YouTube at Mountain Stream TV because this will be up on YouTube later. We'd like to thank Ivan Gibby for the decorations, and today is Ivan Gibby's birthday, so that's the reason he's just not here. I'd like to give thanks to all the precincts that helped us pull this off tonight. We'd like to thank Mike Chris. You'll see him running around here a little bit. He's helped us get things set up. And I would like also to say to the BC2 folks, thanks, a little extra thanks for helping us pull this off. But I appreciate all the precincts. We appreciate all the help that we've been able to get here tonight. And with that, I would like to introduce Catherine Cupperson. Is going to be our moderator. She's also our Secretary Treasurer for BC2. My running buddy, partner in crime, Catherine.
Thanks, Ginger. It's actually Catherine Gant now, but that's okay. First of all, I'd like to recognize our planning committee and for this event, for Dr. McCrae to be here, and Janice has been instrumental in it, but the people on the committee, and I think some of them, or most of them are gone right now, that John Quinnett, Rick Bryson, myself, and Janice Neva. And let me introduce a little bit about Janice Inabinett. I think we all know her. If you've been in Swain County more than 5 minutes, you probably have heard of Janice. And she's just about my best friend in the whole world. She was born here in Bryson City. She holds a master's degree in social work from Chapel Hill. She's been active in improving social conditions wherever she's been ever since. And it is my pleasure to be here and introduce her as our interviewer. Because this is going to be an interview format, and Janice is going to be our interviewer. Will you stand up and take a curtsy?
Thank you, Pat.
And which brings me to our next guest, Dr. Elizabeth Gillespie Mcrae. She's from Virginia, received a doctorate in history from the University of Georgia in 2004. She's now, and she has become, I think she was working in Western even at that time, and she has become an associate professor of history at Western Carolina University. She's also the director of the Graduate Social Science Program at Western. And she has recently wrote a book, which that's why we're here, called The Mothers of Massive Resistance. And it is my pleasure to introduce her to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm feeling so honored to be able to be here to try to hold a space, not only for you, the listeners, a safe place for you to hear what Dr. McCrae has to say, but also to provide a space for her to tell her story. You might have seen some of the things that we've done regarding Women's History Month lately, and it's a big thing to know a woman, know her story, know what she has done, know how she did it, and most of all, know why she did it. So with that, Dr. McCrae, may I call you Elizabeth?
You may, or Libby, either one.
May I tell you
That's better than Dr. McCrae.
This little part about her. I had the opportunity to see something that she had published in the Washington Post back in December. And so I read the article and I thought, oh, this is some good stuff. And so I thought, who wrote this? And so I Googled her. And lo and behold, she had her name and her phone number on the internet. And it said Western Carolina University. And I'm like, I'm here in Bryson City and she's just right around the corner. So I dialed her number. I got an answering machine and I thought, okay, that's the end of that. She called me back within 30 minutes. And she penciled tonight in. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for coming. I was like, what? She's like, is this the author? I'm like, is it? Is this Yes, it is. But I had, yes, so I'm
So
really
tell my
honored for being
friends
involved.
here a little bit about growing up. Catherine mentioned you grew up in,
Virginia. So I grew up in southwestern Virginia, kind of like Swain County. I'm closer to 4 other state capitals than my own. I grew up on the edge of the coal fields. Some of you might be familiar with Bluefield, West Virginia. So it's a split, right? Bluefield, West Virginia, and Bluefield, Virginia, and I lived about 15 minutes south of that on a family farm that my people had been there since the Revolutionary War. They'd come, who knows if this is true or not, but Gillespie had brought back the boots of his friend who died at the Battle of Kings Mountain to his mother, who was a Bowen that lived over the mountain from where I grew up. So I grew up on a sheep and cattle farm, and I grew up, like the rest of my family, as mountain Republicans. So, yeah. I know, they haven't had me come talk. The coal miners where I lived were Democrats, and the farmers were Republicans. But so I grew up in politics mattered, and everybody taught politics, and they said it didn't matter how you voted, but you better vote. And as soon as I could vote, I had to vote, and I went to precinct meetings, and it might be, maybe I have a romantic view of it, but it seemed like, well, I was young. So, but my parents had been public school teachers as well as farmers, so they were huge advocates for public education, which is pretty out of line, I think, of the Republican Party today. That's where I grew up, on a farm. I came to North Carolina to college. I went to Wake Forest. My dad had been a football coach. I thought I wanted to go to Duke, and he said, no, don't go to Duke. At that point, Wake was a lot cheaper, and I didn't want to be a doctor. And I think at Wake, I became a history major and swore I would do anything but become a teacher. So that you should never make those statements, right? Because I don't want you. I finished at Wake Forest and went to Washington, D.C., where I worked for a political event planning company. And I swore I would never do anything with politics again, right? There were an equal number of Democratic women and Republican women, and that was so they could throw parties and plan events for both sides. And they couldn't do it if they were just one or the other. But, and then I taught school, and I taught school in Northern Virginia in a public school that was one of the wealthiest in the country. And then I came to Southwestern Virginia and taught in my old high school, which was one of the poorest in the state of Virginia. And the students there, and this is similar across the United States in places, they got $1,500 worth of state money a year, and the students I've worked with outside Washington, D.C. had gotten $4,500 in state money per year. And so the education was vastly different. And I decided that, why was that? And I came to Western, actually, to get a master's in history. I moonlighted as a bartender at night, and the art history professor at Western was like, you should come to Western. I was like, okay. So I came to Western and studied history, and then went to Georgia. And then they called me and said, because you're a public school teacher, we need somebody to come back and help us train teachers. Would you consider taking a job at Western? And I was like, yes, and I've been there ever since. So that's like my story, right? Which maybe is too long, but I mean, the roots, my roots are certainly in the Mountain South, and a family that politics mattered. They still love me, even though I'm not a Republican anymore, but I'm not a vegetarian, so I'm still eating meat, so I get to stay, right, as part of my family. So I really appreciate you all having me here. It was an interesting book to write. It's a controversial topic in so many ways, and I look forward to talking with you all about it.
so where all did your research take you to get ready to write this book?
So I was interested. Well, I also said I would never do women's history because that's what women were supposed to do. And I did. But I was working on, I was interested in women getting the right to vote, and I kept coming across women who campaigned not for women to have the right to vote. I was like, that's weird, right? Like, why would they want the right to vote? And that sort of put me on this research path, like, maybe women's history is more complicated, right? And why would they not want the right to vote? And so as I started researching that, I started tracking these women who had opposed women's suffrage. And I went to the Delta, Mississippi. My advisor was like, oh, you should go look at this woman's papers. And then it sort of, I looked at who she was writing to. She was a DAR member and a UDC member and a member of the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party then, right, was different than the Democratic Party is today.
You started using initials, so
And the Daughters of the American Revolution and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so I went to the Delta, and then I went to Jackson. I ended up in Columbia, South Carolina, and Atlanta, and Athens, Georgia. And then I just kept following people. It's not as systematic as maybe it should be. And I ended up in Rockbridge County, Virginia, at local libraries. And then I ended up in Boston doing research. So, and finally, after years, my dean said, I don't think we can send you any more places. And I was like, there's everywhere I go, I find all these women that have these archives, and lots of times they hadn't been cataloged, right? So I found this collection by a woman who owned a newspaper in Mississippi and written for 55 years. And she has 82 boxes of papers, and they're just sitting there, right? Not cataloged. And so, and everywhere I went, I found like these women that were really politically active, that were working for a host of conservative causes. And so it took me everywhere. I called people from California to New York to talk to them about what they'd done. And so I sort of, that was like, I know you don't want me to give away what the book's about just yet.
Well, the
those
thing
are all
is
the
that
places I went.
I'm trying to lay a foundation here. I never know how to lay lines, whatever. But words that you're going to be using for the artists. Remember, I had to get you to say that because you're in it, right? So, as words you're going to be using like Jim Crow, and you're going to use conservative, and you're going to use progressive, and you're going so. Tell us, give us some definitions so we know kinda. And remember that we're not trying to get a PhD in history.
She asked me for books. I sent her how many. Like, she's like, I want to do something. I'm like, oh, I'm going to send you 10 books. Okay, you can read. So out of that research, what I found, reading all these women's papers and letters to senators and governors and business owners, was that many of these women that I had started tracking, their first and foremost political commitment was to maintain racial segregation. So, and they weren't like George Wallace, right, standing and yelling in the schoolhouse doors. They were doing stuff on the ground. And that was why some of them hadn't wanted the right to vote, because they felt like it would open up the vote to black women. And it was, they could wield influence without the vote, and they thought they would lose it. But then some women that campaigned for the vote, right, also had said, if we get the vote, there'll be this many more thousand white women voting, and we can uphold racial segregation. And so the whole suffrage campaign that started in 1920, right, in the South, and I thought I was going to stay in the South and do research, that in the South was tied up with the system of racial segregation, right? The legal system of white over black that earned the name of the Jim Crow South. And so as I followed, so the Jim Crow South starts in about the 1890s and it goes through at least 1965. And wait, we can argue about what those dates are, but that's sort of the era of segregation. And so I decided I would look at women's political work in maintaining racial segregation during that whole time period. And so when I say Jim Crow, I'm talking about that era. When I say Jim Crow South, we're talking about the place, right, where the laws were written in. But we were also a Jim Crow nation. And those practices worked differently in different places, right? That didn't have the laws, but had policies that upheld it. So that's what I mean when I say Jim Crow, and I call these women, many of them segregationists, if they're committed to upholding that, right? If they say, I'm going to uphold white over black. And I'm going to make sure that every essay that they write in the schools is about how segregation is important, right? So when I say segregationist, that's what I mean. Some of these women were progressives, right? Some of these women were involved in public health campaigns and expansion of public education and prison reform and campaigns against capital punishment, but they also were for racial segregation. Later, those segregationists who are all, right, the only thing you could be if you were a white woman in the South and politically active until after World War II was a Democrat. Right, so they're all Democrats. Now later, right, the partisan allegiance changes in the South with the Civil Rights Movement, and those women who had been segregationist move, and they're some of the first people that moved into the Republican Party. So men move later, right, because they have a big stake in like Democratic partisan, like committee-ships, right, and get money and do all that, but the women aren't in that system, so the women begin to move, some of them to the Republican Party in the 40s and 50s, and then really move into the right in the 1960s, and some go way right, so to the far right, to white nationalist organizations, sort of the precursors of some of the organizations we have at work today. But a lot of them sort of just stay in between, right, the far right and the center. Lots of folks, and probably if you close your eyes and think about the civil rights movement and you see Ruby Bridges going into the school in New Orleans, or you see the Little Rock Nine, and you think about the pictures are filled with white women, right? There's men too, right? But they're filled, in New Orleans in particular, they're filled with white women. And then if you fast forward, right, to busing, right, the busing crisis that was national, it's also white women, right, arguing against busing. And so I think, so when I talk about conservatives, sometimes they're segregationists and sometimes they're not, but my segregationist women move into conservative political circles for the most part. So that's conservative, progressive, Jim Crow. Massive resistance is like 1954 generally to 1964, and it's the idea that that's when the white South sort of mobilized against the civil rights movement. I think massive resistance is much longer. So I reject that time period, and I see it as much longer. And I think by stretching it out, we get to see a lot more people acting to sort of sustain the system of racial segregation before the civil rights movement and after 1965. I don't know, is that helpful?
Yeah, because
You can be like in the back, you can be like, cut it off.
and I wanted to know that in defining, you opened up a whole nother, you started talking about the far right, the middle right.
Yeah.
So it's all intertwined.
Yes.
Yeah. Did we cover white supremacy?
Oh, no. So, racial segregation and the Jim Crow South, right? This legal apparatus that upholds white over black, right? Those are segregation laws, but they are in service of a larger political agenda, right? That we call white supremacy, right? And so the Jim Crow South and racial segregation serves a larger political agenda of white supremacy. In other places that also have white supremacist politics, like Southern California, right, like Boston, like Detroit, those politics are served by a different system, right, a different system of not legal segregation. So white supremacy is bigger than legal segregation. Does that make sense? A little?
White supremacy is, go on, you want to do it, baby.
Yeah, so, right, if there are Jim Crow laws, right, and they're in the South, why do we have these Jim Crow laws as a nation? We have them to ensure white elite political, economic, and cultural power, right? It's not just that everybody likes segregation laws, right? It's like it serves its purpose.
So it's a foundational pillar.
Right. This
It's
is
a
what you
foundational
do
pillar.
to get this, right?
And there might be other foundational
Yes,
pillars.
Right, so if I'm in Pasadena, California, they're not gonna have a system of legal segregation, but their school board is gonna say, we're gonna bus these kids to this school from this neighborhood. And the school board's gonna say, we don't like you showing this film, The Brotherhood of Man, that talks about everybody being equal, so we're gonna ban that from the schools. And then the school board says, which is mostly women, we've got this school superintendent that's too radical, right? And he's going to the United Nations meetings, and the United Nations full of communists, and they're talking about racial equality, so we're going to get rid of them. Well, there's no laws that do that, right? But the policies allow them to do that. So, I mean, that's, so in the North and West, it would be, right, customary segregation, right? Practices, not laws. Like the way people behave and the way the policies they create, but not the legal system. But that serves us too.
It's pillars that keep it going.
Right.
Okay.
And I think it's important that we say elite, right? Because it's serving a group of people at the same time that segregation is making sure that poor white people don't get economic and political power either. Right? Because what are they going to give them? They're going to say, oh, well, at least you're better than black people, right? So you don't need economic power and you don't need political power. And if the expansion of the state means that people are going to get more funding for public education across the state in Swain County, just like they do in Wake County, right? Then that's going to serve both poor white and black families in the West. And that's going to take away, right, from the power brokers who are orchestrating, right, these policies. So I think so often you think about segregation in like these racial terms, but it's also class terms, right? That what it does is it makes sure that power is condensed in a particular group of people that don't have these broad interests. Does that mean, like, aren't interested in equality of any kind, right? Economic equality, social equality, cultural equality.
Okay, now we're having a test, and you're going to have to define those things that you define. Because this was heavy, wasn't it? So, Dr. McCrae, can you talk just a little bit about some of the organizations that you ran into that we might see as household names that we just accept as, oh, that's, I talked to a friend of mine and they said, well, I belonged to the Sons of the Confederacy, and all they did was just get dressed up and do reenactments, and that was
Right.
just cute for my kids to get to do.
So I think, not everyone that belongs to all these organizations belongs to it because they're segregationists, right? But within many of these organizations, the PTA being one, right? Within those organizations are people that are working to maintain, in this time period, right, racially segregated schools. So not everybody that's a PTA member, right, is producing this system, but some people are producing it. I think what's most dangerous and is there's also, we're all consuming it whether we want to or not, right? So when your kid, so for example, the PTA and then this group called the Paul Revere Ladies, which doesn't sound bad, right? And the Women for Constitutional Government, that sounds good. And Patriotic American Youth. And the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, at different times conduct essay contests, right, in the public schools about the benefits of segregated schools if you're in the 1950s, like how it's good for everybody. And the scholarship, you might win $500 for doing that. Well, in that day and age, $500 would pay for a 4-year college education. If my daughter came home and said she could write an essay and win a 4-year scholarship for it, I'm not sure I would pay attention to what that essay was about. I hope I would now, right? But like before I did this, I would have been like, go for it, right? Because we want, I'd be glad to send her to school for free. So I think what happens is the power of this system is nobody has to think about it because everywhere they turn, it's reinforced, right? So when you go to school and you get an essay contest that says, right, what are the benefits of social separation, right? And people are like, well, what are the benefits? That's what we've always known. Or you read a history book and it tells this story and it doesn't tell the story of African American history, or it doesn't tell the story of white and blacks in the South that joined together in the 1890s or in North Carolina, right, to overturn the Democratic Party and were disenfranchised, right? It doesn't tell that story. So you grow up thinking this is the way it's supposed to be, right? Or this is the way it is. And so I think the organizations have the power to do certain things, right? And they get better at it, right? Over time, right? Women for Constitutional Government sounds more benign than the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1920s, right? That were really far more politically active than they would be in the 1950s or 60s. So you get groups, or Patriotic American Youth. Well, who's going to say, oh, I'm against Patriotic American Youth, right? But at that time, they're using that organization to say the civil rights movement is unconstitutional, right? And so there are
Is this a
people.
Southern group?
They're all over. Pro America is a national group. Women for Constitutional Government becomes a national group. The Daughters of the American Revolution is national, so is the UDC, frankly, right? So there's some that are Southern. So Patriotic American Youth is Southern, but some of these are national groups, right, that attract people that are invested in the system. And so being a reenactor, right, and dressing up, I mean, whatever, if that's your deal, that does not. You might not know that the organization is also doing these political, I mean, we could talk about reenactments, but like that they have this political agenda that some of its members are trying to institute and hold up different systems of power. I don't know, does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask something. You're talking about very powerful groups that speak in code.
Yes.
And how do you break this chain? And what is the role of women, white women, and responsibility of white women to break this chain and stop this? Because we see today how it careens out of control, and it isn't just women doing it, it's the whole society is enough evil. How would you specify to us sitting here who are white, what tactics would you specify that we can use to break this chain? Because it's very destructive to society at large and to the women who participate in it, whether they realize they're participating in it or not. Sorry to throw all that
I
out.
don't know. Yes.
So you're asking for tools,
Tools,
for example,
yes.
that we can
How do you come to the
use.
quick and stop it?
So I don't know, right? This is why I'm like, whew, I stopped in 1975, and then we got Roy Moore, right, and Donald Trump, and I'm like, oh, people are not asking about white women, and I was like, oh, I thought I'd be a little safe, right, quitting in the 1970s. But I do think you're right. What happens after the 1960s is people who would have said, I am for racial segregation, start saying, oh, I'm working for a colorblind society. Right? They change the language.
Yes, the language. is
Right,
very
and so the
critical.
language becomes more benign, right? Or I'm not, I'm for, I don't know, we'll see how who I'd offend. I'm for school choice,
Yes,
right? Which is the code word that comes after,
exactly.
right, the Brown decision.
Yes.
Right, like it has a very specific historical origin. So this went off, right? Be an Exodus. So then, right, charter schools form as the first charter schools were a reaction to the Brown decision. Now that does not mean everybody, I am not saying that everybody sends their kid to charter school is a segregationist. But it was the agenda of segregationist organizations to diminish the power of public education. And that hurts everybody, in my opinion. And so what happens is now we have a language that is not overtly racist. Well, it wasn't, right? We have a language that wasn't as overtly racist, but in policy was really damaging. So what do we do? I don't ask. I don't know. Yes. I mean, yes.
My name's Natalie. I was born in 1960 in the city of Alexandria, Virginia. I was educated through the city of Alexandria, Virginia public schools. My mother was a Ohio Democrat. My father was these are my adopted parents, the only ones I ever knew. My father was an FFB of Virginia. My mother died on Halloween 1967. I was just starting second grade. I struggled and I survived. Interracial busing and all the conflicts. This is the way it's supposed to be. It was a difficult grain to my old school father. And I could certainly give you 57 years of stories. I'm of the hope that I'm still here and I live in Swain County, which is tough. I'm hoping there's more of me out there. I just wanted to play with my little friends.
Didn't want to be.
I remember the day Martin Luther King was shot and what that did next door and living on one side of the line of the tracks to Lady Bird Johnson public housing. And I really cared less about it. And for me, I'm climbing trees. I like to be outdoors, you know. You're going to be a lady and you're going to do. And then for me to be a part of the Alexandria Assembly that dates back to George Washington Masonic days and debut, whatever. And here come back sons and daughters in military and one's married a woman from Okinawa. Well, that family's no longer
Part of it.
at the dance. And
Well,
so
yeah.
all of this, I'm with you, and it's ridiculous.
Well,
And-
I think we imagine that white women, well, I don't know, it seems like we imagine, right, that white women are sort of inherently, or that women are inherently progressive. And so we're surprised, right, when women do things that we think aren't good for society. Well, I think we should be surprised when men don't do things that are good for society too. I mean, I think in one way we've limited how we see women's political activity. And so what it means is then we don't see all the political work that women have done across the political spectrum. So one answer to your question might be, we need to start recognizing that women have political views that are, some women, antithetical to ideas of equality, to ideas of social justice, to ideas of equal citizenship rights, and to stop being surprised when women vote for Roy Moore.
Yep, exactly.
Right? Or when women, college-educated women, vote for candidates who seem to have this interest that is antithetical to women. I think we need to take women as political actors in their sort of full political sense. And that's the only way, like if we recognize, like, I don't know that white women, I don't know that any group, right, can sort of save society, but if we don't recognize the work they're doing, then we can't combat the work. So I'm less interested in who's doing the work than in making sure that our public schools are doing a good job, right? Or that we're providing public health that is equally accessible across class and racial boundaries. And so I think that's, I'd like to believe that everybody has the same political interest I have, but I know that they do not, right? I know that they don't. So I think part of it is we have to recognize where these systems are maintained, and we have to start fighting in those places. And it's here, where we are.
But I'd like to point out, which several people in this room already know, that some of the women breaking ground are not white women. They are women of color, as the saying goes. I think we're all colored, so I don't know where that expression comes from. But the ones speaking up and saying stuff are not pale of face for the most part. The ones who, after Roy Moore's defeat, if you saw a television interviewing a black woman who decided she, who had never done anything political, was going to run for office, I don't see many white women getting up and doing that kind of thing. And I'd like to say that, you know, you talk about the segregated South and this and that and the other, but like, it's a double segregation, because not only are women in the country not white, a great many of them, and they are bucking the system and speaking up and working to change. I look at people like Maxine Waters, I look at people like Kamala Harris, I look at all these women who are not just pounding on the doors, they're getting down and doing the actual work to get themselves elected. And I would say to white women, just stop, please just stop navel gazing for a minute and just get to work. That, I mean, that may seem simplistic.
Right? I think it's hard to say all of a group are a certain way. And so, yes, in Alabama, black women defeated Roy Moore.
Yeah,
Like
they
statistically, right? There's no question
Exactly.
that is the group of voters that showed up and defeated him.
And showed us up too.
Right. Yes. It showed up. That's who elected him. I mean, that's who defeated him and elected Doug Jones. But I think, you know, there've always been interracial women's alliances. I historically working for justice. I don't know like who does more, right? I mean, I'm not particularly interested in that. But if we're gonna, in the West of this state, if we're gonna rely on women of color who are very active and do lots of things in our society, but we're gonna leave that work up to them, I think that is a real abdication of the responsibility of everybody in the community to do that work. And there's lots of places to do the work, right? And there's lots of places, lots of things that these women worked a long time, and they worked a lot, and they wrote letters, and they wrote newspaper columns, and they showed up to PTA. I don't really know how they did it. I'm like, I'm really inefficient, I guess. Like, they went to PTA meetings, and they lobbied congressmen, and they circulated petitions, and they lost for a long, right? It looked like they were losing for a long time, right? The civil rights movement, it seemed like they were winning. Like, the civil rights movement was going to fundamentally change American society, and it did in a host of ways, but they didn't quit when it looked like things weren't going well. And I think we can talk about the Maxine Waters and the Kamala Harris, but my interest and my whatever, if I have any authority, is that the work's on the ground. Like, the real work that matters is the work that you all do, right? Is the real political fights that we can shape initially, not that we should give up on the national ones, but these women believe they could win this fight at a local level. And in many ways, those victories are the ones that stayed. And so I think that we can focus on the national, but we lose something by not focusing on the local level.
I know my timekeeper has already shook his head and pointed his finger, whatever, but we haven't talked about the book.
We have a little, yeah.
Yeah, I know. So, number one, for those of you who have not seen it, heard about it, it's here and it's available for you tonight. And if you don't take it tonight, she even bought a coupon with a code on it that you can call her and still get the discount that she is going to give us here tonight. But I would like for you, one of the things that I found interesting in the book was your discussion about how eugenics was used to separate mixing. Can you talk just briefly about that?
So, like heard the phrase the Onedrop rule, right? That sort of separates racial categories, and sometimes people think it's far earlier, but it's in the 1920s when those rules are passed. That say if you had any African heritage at all, right, that you're black. And if you're black, that means you're subjected to the Jim Crow laws. And at the same time, right, that's happening, this eugenics movement, which comes out of progressive women, right, women who they thought were saving the nation. So maybe that's one thing, we ought to be cautious when we think we're saving the nation, what we're doing. So women were pushing, right, as social workers to try to strengthen the sort of American stock, right, the American people. And what happens is eugenics is used to reinforce racial segregation, and it takes a really hard turn to the right. So rather than, so laws are passed after eugenics that say, okay, you can't interracially marry. And that's the last piece of legislation in the civil rights movement, right? People integrate schools, they get the right to vote. It's not until 1967 that interracial marriage is upheld by the Supreme Court, is permitted by the Supreme Court. And that restriction had really hardened in the 1920s. And so what you had women doing is you can't sort out people. You sort out people in schools and in hospitals and when they have babies. And the people doing that work were teachers and nurses and midwives, right? Doctors didn't deliver as many babies in the 20s as they did now, women did. And the laws required that women turned in the racial categorization of the babies they delivered. But we all know that race is, right, this like construction. And so if you weren't sure, then there was a list of names that were associated, right, with racial identity. So even if the midwife said, oh, this is a white baby or an Indian baby, and that's the terminology they used, right, then they would turn that in. They're like, oh no, this person's name is Clark if you're in Rockbridge County, Virginia. And we know that the Clarks have all had this mixed heritage, and so they're no longer white and they're no longer Native American, they're black. And so families in the 1920s are rent apart, and there's a cost, right, of you're subjected to Jim Crow education, to Jim Crow healthcare if your family moves into that category. And so what it did was deny all sorts of people's heritage, right, of any sort of interracial mixing, and drew the lines really hard between white and black that didn't reflect society at all. I think, and women did that work. And whether it was because I'm going to be a good social worker and get my degree, or I'm going to be a good teacher and this is what the law says and I'm a rule follower, or I'm a white supremacist, right? I think the reasons could be, but it didn't matter what the reasons were because the work produced the same thing.
Thank you.
Could you define eugenics just briefly? I mean, I understand.
I'm sorry there, I did that.
So eugenics is a science to create a master race.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is before Hitler, so they realized they were really out of step,
And
right? Like 20 years
you
later.
talk a lot about it in the book regarding the Native American people. It really took a toll on Native American people because they didn't know which box they were supposed to check.
Right.
I asked somebody recently, is there going to be a separate but equal heaven? One more question.
I just wondered about the sort of intersection with patriarchy, like the Equal Rights Amendment, how women worked against that. I haven't read your book, but I get this, women working against progressive
Right.
politics is a category that's not particularly well understood or appreciated. So what do you think about that intersection?
So
Patriarchy and race.
I'll give you one answer. It's not the answer, but it is one answer. So when busing came, right, and busing was so controversial nationwide. So white women, not all white women, but white women and white working class women in Boston led the campaigns against busing. Right? They were upset that the feminists did not join them.
Is that all right?
Right? And so they turned on the Equal Rights Amendment and on feminist organizations because they felt like anti-busing was a feminist issue, right? That if they cared about women, they would represent these women who were opposed to busing their children. And so that was one way that they move into this anti-feminist camp. Does that make, like, out of this busing crisis?
Because there's been some good work done on why, Equal Rights Amendment was beat by women.
Yes.
And that's really surprising.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of flushed looked like it was gonna win. It failed North Carolina by 1 vote. And it failed.
Yeah.
North Carolina, maybe one of 3 states that would have passed it. Then it would be the law of the land.
And then states that passed it rescinded it, right? And Phyllis Schlafly, right, who was key to that, had early on been really opposed to the United Nations, and in part she was opposed to the United Nations because she didn't feel that non-white nations were developed enough to sort of make policy in with the U.S. So she was an anti-colonialist, right? Like she was for that colonial power, and so it's not a hard shift to see her shift from that stance, right, into, and then she is like a machine against the equal rights amendment. Yeah. But a lot of my women meet her in their campaigns against the United Nations.
How's my time going?
Well, I can talk to people. I mean, it seems really
She's going to be,
scattered.
Dr. McCrae will be
I don't want to
here.
hold you
She's-
hostage.
And we want to break bread together. There was a time, you know, that we couldn't do that. So we invite you to the reception and to enjoy, spend some time with Dr. McCrae. Please let her also have some refreshments. I really appreciate you coming. I hope that you got one or two things to take home. We didn't talk about the fact that women are now, we didn't talk at all about the fact that letter writing campaigns might have been something for your women in your book. Today, there's no more letter writing campaigns. Women can run for office, get into position where they are the decision makers. They don't have to write to the decision makers and say, please make this happen. And so I suppose that is a topic for another night, or do you want to talk about that just for a minute?
Well, I think we should still write women that are in positions of power to do the things we want to do.
Right, but I'm saying that,
yes.
that women have, they are the people that are the decision makers, so
Some
they,
of them,
yeah. And so when people like Betsy and the Federal Reserve chairperson or, so
Yes.
it's kind of
Yes, it's
a different, it's a different
African
world.
American history. People talk about black faces in high places versus like the grassroots, and I think it's the same way with women, right? You can have women in high places. That does not mean that there is gender equality, right? Or and so I think that divide means that people on the ground have to continue doing. I mean, we have different technology, but doing the same things, the same strategies to change the political system that we've always done.
Well, we
right?
throw
no matter
around,
who's in office.
we throw around the term vet.
Yeah.
And in response to Angela's comment about what a tool, a vetting tool for anybody that's running. How do we vet a person who says, I want to go represent you? How do we vet them to make sure that they aren't going to go to wherever they go in an effort to ensure this?
We ask them lots of questions. I mean, I don't know. We ask them questions about all sorts of policy, right? Because some people, when they get this answer, that's who they want to vote for, right? I mean, we have to also recognize this. When some people say things that indicate that they're for these hierarchical systems and for injustice, people are like, yeah, we're going to vote for them, right? So those of us that don't want those people in power have to continue to ask really good questions and register people to vote and campaign.
And know the
people,
questions to
know the
ask.
questions to ask. Yeah.
Because the coding and the language is tough. I'm stopping. Come back.
You can ask me all the questions you want, but not everyone has to stay and listen to my answers.
Okay, we
I'm
have
really honored.
a
Thank you for
guest
having me.
list. If you would like to know other programs that we will be doing, please give us contact information. But we certainly would just appreciate having your name that says that you were a guest here tonight. Thank you very much.